This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order some Duskmourn cards, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and it's time for my Duskmourn Limited Archetype Guide. Over the last several days, I've looked at every single individual card that can show up in play boosters in this limited format and told you what I think about them. In this video, I'm going to look at each of the 10 color pairs in Duskmourn House of Horror and discuss what their internal synergies are. This is not a video where I'm going to show you cards that are just good in any deck. I'm going to talk about synergies specifically, so it's not about the most powerful premium removal or the biggest bombs in the set, but those are all things that have been covered or will be covered in other videos on this channel. So let's go ahead and dive right in with a look at the 10 color pairs in Duskmourn. First, we're going to look at black-green. It's a grindier Delirium deck. You've got 2 signpost uncommons for every color pair in this format, and they usually do a pretty great job of telling you exactly what you're supposed to do. For example, here we have Brood Spinner and Drag to the Roots. Brood Spinner has Surveil 2, so it helps you load the graveyard, and Delirium's about getting 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. And it has an activated ability that counts the number of card types among cards in your graveyard and gives you more insect creature tokens based on that number. Drag to the Roots isn't an enabler the same way Brood Spinner is, but it is a payoff and it costs 2 generic less to cast when you have Delirium going. So, what are the Delirium cards in this set? Well, we've got the 2 we've already seen. There's also Let's Play a Game, a modal spell that gives you all 3 modes if you have Delirium. There's Osseous Stick Twister, which has an in-step trigger that makes your opponent sack a non-land permanent or discard a card or take damage equal to Osseous Stick Twister's power if you have Delirium. There's Resurrected Cultist, which can come back from the graveyard if you have Delirium. There is Patchwork Beastie, which can only attack and block if you have Delirium, but it's also a Delirium enabler because it lets you mill a card every upkeep. You've got Spineseeker Centipede, a 3-mana 2/1 that searches up a land, but also becomes bigger if you have Delirium. And there's Wickerfolk Thresher, which has a really powerful attack trigger when you have Delirium. So, what are some of the ways to get Delirium? Well, you've got things like Brood Spinner, which have Surveil. Any card with Surveil in the set will work. This is kind of a stand-in for it. You've also got cards like Commune with Evil. This lets you look at the top 4 cards of your library, you put 1 into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. It's conceivable that this could unlock Delirium all on its own. It's not always going to line up that way, but it could. You've also got Cynical Loner, a card that has a survival trigger that lets you tutor up any card in your deck and put it into your graveyard, so it can help you get that 4th card type sometimes. Any card with Manifest Dread can help you get Delirium because Manifest Dread has you put a card into the graveyard as part of its effect. You've also got cards like Greenhouse and Rickety Gazebo. The Rickety Gazebo side can potentially unlock Delirium for you because it mills 4 cards and then you can return a couple of permanents. There's also Say Its Name, a 2-mana sorcery that mills 3 cards and then lets you return stuff from your graveyard, so you can see how that would work well too. One notable thing to think about when you're looking at Delirium is that cards that are enchantment creatures and artifact creatures are a little bit better because those can single-handedly give you 2 of the 4 card types that you need. Rares that work well here, I have Demonic Council here. It is a really bad tutor that can only grab demons, but if you have Delirium, it becomes Demonic Tutor. Balustrade Worm is a big old worm that can come back from the graveyard if you have Delirium. Head Shredder doesn't have Delirium itself, but it does mill cards when it attacks. Omnivorous Flytrap puts counters all over everything if you have Delirium. And the Swarm Weaver buffs all of your insects and spiders if you have Delirium, including the ones that it makes. So that's black-green. It's kind of a grindier Delirium deck. Red-green is also a Delirium deck in this format, and it's more of a stompy deck. In other words, it's more about your creatures getting big and doing lots of damage with them. And that is what both of these signposts and commons tell us. Beastie Beatdown is a rabid bite effect that gives you a couple of +1/+1 counters if you have Delirium. And Wildfire Wickerfolk is a 2-mana 3/2 with haste that also gains trample and +1/+1 if you have Delirium. So again, we've got Patchwork Beastie, which may actually be more well-positioned for this deck since it's a big old creature. We have Spineseeker Centipede, which is probably just as good in this deck as it is in black-green, and Wickerfolk Thresher again, but then there are some other cards in red that have Delirium. One of them is Fear of Burning Alive. It does 4 to each opponent when it enters, but if you have Delirium, you also get to do 4 to one of their creatures, and it gives you that buff to all non-combat damage you do to your opponent, so anything you target and hit your opponent with damage-wise also becomes a removal spell. You've got Hand that feeds, a 2-mana 2/2 that becomes a 2-mana 4/2 with Menace when you have Delirium. You've got Impossible Inferno, a 5-mana deal 6 instant, gives you a card if you also have Delirium. And Violent Urge, a combat trick that gets better if you have Delirium, because instead of just +1/+0 and first strike, you also get double strike. So, some of the ways to get Delirium, some of the cards that are well suited for helping you get Delirium are the same in red-green. Obviously, the green ones, like Rickety Gazebo and Say Its Name. But you also have Grab the Prize, a card that can put 2 cards into your graveyard itself and whatever it is you discard. And sacrifice effects like Diversion Specialist can also help you out with Delirium. Rares that are well suited here, well, you've got Peer Past the Veil. This has you discard your hand, but then you draw X cards, where X is the number of card types among cards in your graveyard. You've got Fear of Missing Out, a 2-mana 2/3 enchantment creature that can help you get Delirium because it rummages when it enters, and then it also has a Delirium trigger that gives you an extra combat step. The Roller Crusher Ride is a really powerful legendary enchantment that is pretty good even if you never have Delirium, but if you do have Delirium, it does a ton of damage and is incredibly efficient and can get pretty close to just wiping your opponent's board. We have Balustrade Worm and Omnivorous Flytrap and Head Shredder again as well. So those are the 2 Delirium decks. They are not the only graveyard decks though, because Black-White is also a graveyard deck. It just doesn't care that much about Delirium. Instead, it's a Reanimator deck. In other words, it's about getting a big creature into your graveyard early, like Shroud Stomper, one of the Signpost uncommons, a 7-mana 5/5 Death Touch with a powerful enter or attack trigger that makes your opponent lose 2, you gain 2, and you draw a card. So you get something like that into the graveyard, and then you bring it back with the other Signpost uncommon, which is Rite of the Moth, a 4-mana card that lets you reanimate a creature with a finality counter on it. And it has Flashback, which is nice because that means if you mill it while trying to get reanimation stuff into your graveyard, you can use it. Even from your graveyard, it also means if you cast it early, you can cast it again late. And so, this is what the Black-White deck is all about, and I think they actually did a pretty good job of seeding the format with just the right amount of stuff to make this work. I could end up eating those words. We've seen a lot of Reanimator decks not pan out. They've only panned out on occasion, but I do feel, looking at the set right now, that they gave us enough tools to try to do it at least. So I sort of put things in 2 different piles here. The stuff on the left is all reanimation spells, and the stuff on the right is the stuff you really want to reanimate at lower rarities. So on the left, you've got Rite of the Moth, again, but also Valgavoth's Faithful, a 1-mana 1/1 that you can pay 4 and sacrifice to reanimate something. Emerge from the Cocoon, a 5-mana reanimation spell that also gains you 3 life. And Live or Die, a reanimation spell that's an instant, so you can basically flash a creature into play, but it can also be a removal spell in a pinch. Then on the right, you've got Miasma Demon, a big flying demon that also lets you discard cards to give -2/-2 to stuff, so it can also help you put things in the graveyard. Shroud Stomper, we've already seen. Vile Mutilator and Fear of Abduction are both big flyers that have additional costs you have to pay, but if you're reanimating them, you don't have to pay those additional costs, and that's good because when the 2 of them enter, they both have powerful enter the battlefield abilities. The Mutilator makes your opponent sacrifice a non-token enchantment and a non-token creature, and Fear of Abduction exiles a creature an opponent controls. I have Defiled Crypt because this is probably the best deck for it. The Defiled Crypt side gives you a 2/2 Black Horror enchantment creature token anytime a creature leaves your graveyard, and Cadaver Lab is a way to get a creature back, though it doesn't put it into play. So I think they did just enough to give us what we need to reanimate. There are some common cards you can reanimate too, but the ones on the right are definitely the premium ones. You can also use the Land Cyclers in a pinch, which are at common and can put themselves into the graveyard. Let's look at the rares that are well suited here. Well, you've got Overlord of the Baelmerk. It's well suited here because it mills you and gets creatures back from the graveyard. It's also not a bad thing to reanimate. Valgavoth and Doomsday Excruciator are pretty impossible to cast when you're not reanimating them, but when you do, they're pretty insane. They're both likely to win you the game, especially Valgavoth because his ward makes it so that even if your opponent does kill him, they put themselves so far behind on board that they have no hope of ever catching up. And then there's also Victor Valgavoth Seneschal. It's a little bit weird as sort of the signpost rare because it cares about enchantments, and Black-White on the whole doesn't care a ton about them. But I do have it here because it's Black-White, and if you can trigger Eerie 3 times in a turn, it does reanimate something. All right, so those are the 3 most graveyard-oriented decks. Let's move now into the enchantment-oriented decks, starting with Blue-Black. This is a grindier deck that's interested in graveyard stuff alongside enchantments, and that's what both of these signpost uncommons tell you. Fear of Infinities, a 3-mana 2/2 with flying and lifelink that can't block. but it has an Eerie trigger, which is something that triggers anytime an enchantment you control enters or when you fully unlock a room. When you do that, it comes back from the graveyard to your hand, and Skull Snap Nuisance surveils 1 with every Eerie trigger. So both of these like the graveyard and they like enchantments. So what are the Eerie payoffs here? Well, you've got Erratic Apparition, which gets +1/+1 for each Eerie trigger. You've got Scrabbling Skull Crab, which mills 2 with every Eerie trigger. Probably going to be better if you mill yourself with it in this particular deck, since you have cards that like the graveyard. You've also got Stalked Researcher, a 2-mana 3/3 with Defender that can attack if you trigger Eerie. You've got Unwilling Vessel, a 3-mana 3/2 Vigilance that gains a counter anytime you trigger Eerie, and when it dies, gives you a flying spirit token with power and toughness equal to the number of those counters. You've also got Creeping Peeper, which can tap for mana for enchantments. You've also got Balemerk Leech and Dashing Bloodsucker, 2 black cards with Eerie triggers. Balemerk Leech makes your opponent lose 1 life, and Dashing Bloodsucker gains +2/+0 and lifelink. There are a couple of rares that are well suited to this deck. You've got Nashi, Searcher in the Dark, which is kind of the blue-black signpost. It's a 2-mana 2/2 menace. When it hits your opponent, you mill cards equal to the damage, and you put any number of legendary or enchantment cards from among them into your hand, and if you put no cards into your hand this way, you put a +1/+1 counter on Nashi. So he likes enchantments and he likes the graveyard. Entity Tracker has a powerful Eerie trigger that draws you a card. So that's blue-black. It is a grindier enchantment deck. There's also blue-white, which is built around the Eerie mechanic as well, and it's more aggressive. You can see that from its 2 signposts and commons, both of which are 2-drops. One of them has an Eerie trigger that makes a 1/1 Gremlin creature token, and the other one decreases the cost of your enchantments and decreases the cost of your unlock effects. So what payoffs do we have here? Well, we've got Ethereal Armor, a 1-mana aura that gives +1/+1 and First Strike for each enchantment you control. You've also got Optimistic Scavenger, a 1-mana 1/1 that puts a +1/+1 counter on something for every Eerie trigger. Cult Healer, which gains lifelink with Eerie. Erratic Apparition, which we've seen before. Scrabbling Skull Crab probably doesn't make any sense in this particular deck since it's not particularly aggressive. And the same might be true of the Researcher, though. If you can trigger Eerie every turn, it can attack. We've also got Unwilling Vessel and Creeping Peeper again. Rares that work here? Well, there's a blue-white mythic rare that makes 2 enchantment tokens, so it can trigger Eerie twice in addition to being able to turn those tokens into copies of a creature. Ghostly Dancers either returns an enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand or unlocks a locked door on a room you control when it enters. Also has an Eerie trigger that gives you a 3/1 flyer. And then there's also Entity Tracker. So that's blue-white, a more aggressive, tempo-oriented Eerie deck. From here, let's look at blue-red. It also cares about enchantments, but in particular, the room subtype. This one does worry me a little bit. I don't feel like a lot of the cards are pushed enough to really be good enough, but this is what the blue-red deck is supposed to be, and I would like if it worked out because I think it looks like a lot of fun. So you got 2 signposts and commons here. One of them is a room. The Smoky Lounge side gives you mana to spend on rooms, and Misty Salon is like the win condition for this style of deck, with the idea being that you unlock it and get a big blue spirit creature token with flying. Even if you just unlock the lounge and then unlock the salon in the next turn, you do get a 2/2 flyer, but I am worried that's too slow. You also got Intruding Soul Rager, which is a 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance, and you can sacrifice a room to do 2 damage to each opponent and draw a card. Another awkward thing here is that Misty Salon and Intruding Soul Rager don't necessarily have synergy with each other, because Misty Salon wants you to have unlocked doors in play, and the Soul Rager wants you to throw your rooms away for value. That worries me too. Additionally, there aren't really that many payoffs either. So you've got these 2, but you've also got Ghostly Keybearer, a 4-mana 3/3 flyer that can unlock a locked door of a room you control when it hits your opponent. You also have Infernal Phantom. It has Eerie, and in this particular deck, you're likely to do it with doors more often than anything. Rampaging Soul Rager also likes it when you have lots of unlocked doors among rooms you control. Again, kind of a non-bow with Intruding Soul Rager. Rares that work here? Well, there is a blue-red rare door that's pretty powerful. One side's a removal spell, the other side draws you extra cards. There's also Central Elevator and Promising Stairs. Gave this an F in the set review, and I think I stand by that. But if it does work in any deck, it will work in this one because it lets you tutor up a door. And the other side has a Surveil effect followed by an alternate win condition. Then there's also Marina Vendrell, who really likes doors. She can lock and unlock them at will, which could give you a lot of value, you know, if games last forever or something. But yeah, you can see why I'm a little skeptical of blue-red. I have a feeling if it works out, it's going to be like a tempo-oriented deck with like a door sub-theme more than anything else, rather than an all-in doors deck. Let's move now to black-red. It is a sacrifice deck, as it often is, but it's got an enchantment thing going on too, because all of the effects that say you can sack a creature also say you can sacrifice an enchantment. So, we've got Disturbing Mirth as one of the signpost uncommons. It is a sacrifice outlet that when it enters lets you sack one of those things, and if you do, you draw two. And if you sacrifice Disturbing Mirth itself, you get to manifest Dread. So it is both an outlet and a payoff, which is really, really cool. Sawblade Skin Ripper starts as a 3-mana 3/2 menace, but you can pay 2 generic and sack creatures or enchantments to put a counter on it. And it has a general sacrifice payoff effect that does 1 damage for each permanent you sacrificed in a turn at the beginning of your end step. So if you're sacrificing things for other effects in addition to its own, you get that effect. It's going to work well with like Terramorphic Expanse too, which is always fun when you can sack a land and turn it into a ping effect. So what are the payoffs and outlets here? Well, we've got these two. We've also got Fear of Lost Teeth. This is great sacrifice fodder because it does 1 damage to any target and you gain a life when you sack it, and it only costs 1, so you may be able to pick something off and get an extra effect. You've got Final Vengeance, which is a Bone Splinters-like effect, except you can sack an enchantment instead of just a creature, and it exiles the creature, which certainly matters here. You've also got Innocuous Rat, which is great sacrifice fodder because then it manifests Dread when it dies. You've got Popular Egotist, which is a sacrifice outlet that can give it indestructible, but it also drains 1 life anytime you sacrifice a permanent. I have Sporogenic Infection here as kind of a stand-in for any black or red enchantment that has a primary effect that happens when it enters, which is what the infection does. It's an edict, basically. You're going to feel fine about sacrificing it in many situations because the other effect it has is relatively minor. But this also works with things like doors that have abilities that only trigger when you unlock them and you don't need them anymore. I've got Vile Mutilator here. It's probably better in the Reanimator deck, but in this deck, you can have something very expendable to sacrifice, really put your opponent in a much worse position than you're in. You've also got Betrayer's Bargain, a removal spell that's cheaper if you sacrifice a creature enchantment. You've got Boiler Bilge's Ripper, a 5-mana 4/4 that does 2 to any target when you sacrifice something with its trigger. Clockwork Percussionist, which effectively draws you a card when it dies. Diversion Specialist, which allows you to sacrifice creatures or enchantments and effectively draw cards. You've also got Vengeful Possession. You know, threaten effects like this are always really, really good in this kind of deck because you can steal their thing and then sacrifice it to your Final Vengeance. It's just a back-breaking play. And like I mentioned, doors work pretty well here too. Some rares that are good here. Well, you've got Undead Sprinter, a 2-mana 2/2 with trample and haste that just won't stay dead. As long as something has died on your turn that isn't a zombie, whether it's yours or your opponent's, you can just bring it back. That makes it pretty good sacrifice fodder. I have Come Back Wrong here, which I think is just a good removal spell in general, but it only temporarily gives you the creature that you kill, and if you can generate even more value out of that temporary creature by sacrificing it to something, it's going to feel pretty great. An Unstoppable Slasher is nice sacrifice fodder because it doesn't stay dead. That's black-red. It's a sacrifice deck that likes to sacrifice enchantments just as much as it likes to sacrifice creatures. Let's move now to blue-green, which is all about the manifest Dread mechanic, and it has 2 really good signpost uncommons. Both of them are really cheap too. Growing Dread manifests Dread when it enters. It's got flash, and when you turn a permanent face up, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it both does the thing you want to do, manifest Dread, and pays you off for it by giving you a +1/+1 counter when you turn those things face up. And I think overall, the manifest Dread mechanic is pretty strong. It's really priced to move, just like it is on Growing Dread, and paying 2 mana for a 2/2 with relatively big upside. I mean, you get to put a card in your graveyard which has value, and then there's a chance that the thing you played face down can get bigger later. Like, that's a really good deal, and that's how a lot of the Manifest Dread in the set looks. It just seems like it gives you a lot of value for the trigger. The other signpost uncommon is not a Manifest Dread enabler, but it is a super powerful payoff. It's a 2-mana 2/3, and at the beginning of your end step, you get to draw a card. You then have to discard if you haven't put a manifest creature into play or turned a permanent face up in your turn, but that's still a good card, like 2-mana 2/3 loot every turn, good card, but you get to keep the card, not have to discard anything if you have manifested Dread or turned a card face up. So what are the other payoffs here? Well, we've got Creeping Peeper again. It's kind of nice that it slips into all these different decks. It's good with the enchantment decks, but it also helps you turn permanents face up. Paranormal Analyst is a super powerful payoff because when you manifest Dread, normally you put one card in the graveyard, one into play face down as a 2/2, but with the Analyst in play, you just keep the other card and still put one into play face down. So it turns Manifest Dread into a 2/2 that draws you a card, which is pretty insane. You've got Cryptid Inspector, a 3-mana 2/3 with Vigilance that gains a +1/+1 counter whenever a face down permanent you control enters, and whenever a face down permanent is turned face up, including itself. So if you manifest Dread it and turn it face up, it becomes a 3/4 Vigilance. You've also got Overgrown Zealot, which helps you turn things face up. You've got Threats Around Every Corner, which, like Growing Dread, is both an enabler because it manifests Dread and a payoff because anytime you have a face down permanent enter, you get to search up a basic land. So, Manifest Dread looks like a cool mechanic to me. It's probably the one I'm most excited about in this format, and this archetype looks like they gave us enough nice build-arounds to make it work. What are the rares that work well here? Well, you've got Abhorrent Oculus, which is good both because it manifests Dread at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, but also it's one of the best things in the set to manifest Dread because it has this difficult additional cost, especially in the early game it's difficult, where you have to exile 6 cards from your graveyard, but if you manifest Dread it, you only have to pay 3 to turn it face up, and you get a 5/5 flyer that starts generating a 2/2 during your opponent's turn every turn. You've got Hauntwood Shrieker, which can attack and manifest Dread, and it can also turn face down things face up for 1 generic and a green. And you've got Valgavoth's Onslaught, which is going to be pretty busted in like any deck in the format because it just always gives you really good value. It lets you manifest Dread X times and then put X +1/+1 counters on them. Going to be even better in this deck since you have payoffs for doing that. Let's move now to Green-White, which is a survival deck. Survival is one of the new mechanics in the format. You can see it on Shrewd Storyteller, and it means at the beginning of your second main phase, if this creature's tapped, you get an effect. In the case of the Storyteller, you get a +1/+1 counter. It's pretty sweet because you can sort of just keep putting the counter on it and it will still be able to attack more effectively on the next turn too, thanks to that counter, and just keep snowballing. But you can also put the counters on other survival things so that they have a better chance of surviving. And obviously, the most natural way for a creature to trigger survival is just to attack, but there are a number of ways to trigger it otherwise. One of them is Baseball Bat. This is an equipment that equips for free the first time, gives a creature +1/+1, which might help a survival creature attack without any danger to begin with, but you can also use it to tap your own creature with the attack trigger if a survival trigger is worth it. You can also tap your opponent's thing and get in for a bunch of damage. There are a bunch of cards with survival. I'm not going to go over every single one of them, but I did think it was worth looking at the different ways you can trigger survival apart from just attacking normally. So we've got Baseball Bat. There's also Fear of Immobility, a 5-mana 4/4 that you can use to tap your own creature, so you can trigger survival. I have Jump Scare here as a stand-in for any combat trick. These are going to play pretty well in the Green-White deck. That worries me a little bit because tricks are already so swingy, but if you try to block a survival creature because you're like, wow, I really don't want to deal with that survival trigger because it's too good, your opponent then uses a combat trick, runs over your creature, and then gets a survival trigger that kind of makes up for the card they used in the first place, like that's going to be pretty backbreaking. There are also some cards like Hardened Escort that make an attacking creature harder to kill. It gives +1/+0 and indestructible to another attacking creature. Orphans of the Wheat, when it attacks, you can tap any number of untapped creatures you control to buff it, and obviously that can help you out with survival. Coordinated Clobbering is a 1-mana removal spell that has you tap your creatures for them to do damage to an opposing creature. You can tap up to 2 of them. It's a great removal spell that also happens to trigger survival. You've got Fear of Exposure, a big 5/4 trampler that you can tap creatures for when you cast it. There's also Flesh Burrower. It's kind of in the same category as Hardened Escort, as it can give an attacking creature death touch. It's not as likely to keep your creature alive, but it does make it a lot harder on your opponent if they want to try to kill it when it has death touch. I also have Manifest Dread here because Manifest Dread in general can help you out with survival, because if you attack with a creature when it's face down and your opponent doesn't know it has survival, you can then turn it face up later and get the survival trigger. Rares that work well here, well, you've got Rip Spawn Hunter, a 4-mana 4/4 that has a survival trigger. It lets you look at the top X cards of your library where X is its power, and you can put any number of creatures or vehicles with different powers from among them into your hand, so he's usually going to draw you at least one card, sometimes more. Reluctant Role Model is a 2-drop that's going to be really scary to see on actual turn 2 because it has a survival trigger that gives itself flying, lifelink, or +1/+1 counters. If it gets flying, it's going to be pretty difficult to block. and just keep snowballing. And then it lets you put your counters wherever, not just Reluctant Role Models counters, but every one of your creatures gets to do that. The Wandering Rescuer is a huge bomb anywhere, but it has Convoke, and Convoke is a way to tap down your own stuff to help cast her, so can help you with survival. It is a little awkward that she has flash too. Most of the time, you're probably not going to use her to set up survival unless you have like a bunch of survival triggers, because flashing her in out of nowhere, giving your tapped creatures hexproof, and blocking with like a 3/4 double striker is probably going to be more meaningful. You've also got Unidentified Airship, a nice vehicle that's also a removal spell, and I have it here because crewing a vehicle taps your creature. Same thing for Head Shredder. And one thing to keep in mind with these vehicles is you can tap any number of creatures for them. So if you have multiple survival things that you really want to trigger, you can tap all of them, even with Crew 1. There is also Kona Rescue Beastie, a 4-mana 4/3 with a survival trigger that's usually pretty underwhelming and limited. It lets you put a permanent from your hand onto the battlefield, but hey, it has survival. And our last color pair is red-white. It's an aggro deck, but it does have a bit of a theme. That theme being about cards that have power 2 or less. This lines up pretty well in the format. All the Manifest Dread things will trigger it. Most of the tokens in the format will trigger it. And, you know, most aggro decks have a bunch of cards that have power 2 or less anyway. So the two signpost uncommons here both tell us about this power 2 or less thing. Arabella deals X damage to each opponent and you gain X life when she attacks, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 2 or less. And Midnight Mayhem is 4 mana for 3/1/1 red gremlin creature tokens with Menace, Lifelink, and Haste until end of turn. Also gives those keywords to your other gremlins, and there are a few of them in this set. Obviously, if you play Midnight Mayhem and Arabella together, that's a pretty disgusting turn. So let's look a little deeper at the theme of power 2 or less within red-white. So we've got Arabella. There's also Living Phone, a 3-mana 2/1, so it triggers all those things that care about 2 or less power. And when it dies, you get to look at the top 5 cards and put a creature card with power 2 or less from among them into your hand. There's also Split Skin Doll, a 2-mana 2/1 that loots when it enters. But if you have a creature in play with power 2 or less other than the doll, you get to hold on to that card, so it just turns into a straight up 2-for-1. Irreverent Gremlins, a 2-mana 2/2 with Menace that lets you rummage every time a creature with power 2 or less enters, well, once a turn anyway. Ragged Playmate makes a power 2 or less creature unblockable, and Vicious Clown gains +2/+0 when a creature with power 2 or less enters. There are a couple of rares well suited to this deck. You've got the Jolly Balloon Man, who makes token copies of your creatures that happen to be 1/1s. That will trigger all the things that care about that. And Enduring Innocence is a 3-mana 2/1 lifelinker that has this effect that lets you draw a card once a turn when a creature with power 2 or less enters. And even if your opponent kills it, it comes back as an enchantment. So it's going to draw a lot of cards in this deck. Plus, has 2 power itself. So those are the 10 color pairs in Duskmourn House of Horror. I've now covered every single card in the set individually and talked about each of the 10 color pairs and the synergies they have within them. But there's still a lot of Duskmourn content coming your way. I'm going to be playing in the early access event soon, which means there will be some draft videos coming up later this week. And I'll also be doing videos about this format over the next several weeks where I discuss how it's panned out. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on my set review and stuff like that, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.